Good evening, everyone. Welcome to Pacifica Graduate Institute. My name is Dave Odoricio. I'm the director of our retreat center and associate core faculty in our mythological studies PhD program. It is my real honor and pleasure to welcome you and introduce Dr. Jeff Kripal, our speaker this evening. I want to open with a bit of a historical, I call it fragment. You can tell me if you recognize it, if you know where it comes from. A procession of the damned. By the damned, I mean the excluded. We shall have a procession of data that science has excluded. Battalions of the accursed, captained by pallid data that I have exhumed, will march. You'll read them, or they'll march. Some of them livid, and some of them fiery, and some of them rotten. Charles Ford, 1919, from his Book of the Damned. I have another fragment for you, and we'll play another game. The success of science depends entirely on what it refuses to look at. The only reason science gets to explain everything is because it gets to say what everything is. If you or I want to put things on the table that science cannot study, those things are dismissed as not real or merely anecdotal, and so they're taken off the table. Science can explain everything because science controls what's on the table. Of course, the scientific method is the best way to understand everything on the table because the scientific method determines what goes on the table and what doesn't. I like to put it this way. Our conclusions are a function of our exclusions. We draw conclusions about what's possible because of all of the things we've already decided are impossible. Is that obvious? So here we are, exactly 100 years later, after the publication of the Book of the Damned. Did you do this on purpose? He did do this on purpose. 100 years later, Jeff Kripal's The Flip, Epiphanies of Mind and the Future of Knowledge appeared in the material realm. Now, I think you might already know a little bit about this, otherwise you wouldn't be here. But just to remind you of where you are, we are here to listen to Dr. Kripal talking about his book. The title of the talk is the same title. And a flip, writes Jeff, is a reversal of perspective, a new real, often born of an extreme, life-changing experience. The flip is Kripal's ambitious, visionary program for unifying the sciences and the humanities to expand our minds, open our hearts, and negotiate a peaceful resolution to the culture wars. Combining accounts of rationalists, spiritual awakenings, and consciousness explorations by philosophers, neuroscientists, and mystics within a framework of the history of science and religion, Dr. Kripal compellingly signals a path to mending our fractured world. All right? And I'm pleased to say that Jeff is also the colloquium speaker for our mythological studies program on Monday. Many of the students are here. Yes, thank you for joining us. And he's also a part of our upcoming trauma studies certificate program, which starts this September. And finally, the fancy formal bio. Jeffrey J. Kripal holds the J. Newton Razor Chair in Philosophy and Religious Thought at Rice University, and is the Associate Director of the Center for Theory and Research at the Esalen Institute in Big Sur. He has previously taught at Harvard Divinity School and Westminster College, and is the author of 8 books, joining us from Houston. Jeff has been a very generous friend and mentor, and it is my real pleasure to introduce and welcome him back to Pacifica. Please join me in warmly welcoming Dr. Jeffrey Kripal.
That was great. I got to spend an afternoon in the New York Public Library a few years ago with Fort's notes. That's where he used to take these notes on these little note cards, and they kept them all in the New York Public Library, so you can go and actually kind of figure out how he read. And it's really quite astonishing. If you haven't read Fort, he's wonderful. He's very funny, much funnier than I am. But Thank you. Thank you for comparing us. I'm going to deliver this lecture. It's fairly formal. I'm no good at giving off-the-cuff casual lectures. I just kind of orbit out into space and get lost. So I'm going to stick to the text. I'm going to give you some substance. It's not long. It's only about 3 hours. No, it's about 40 minutes is all. And then we can have a conversation about whatever you want to talk about, because I'm sure you have questions. And part of this actually is basically you stole some of it. Yeah. But that's okay. Okay, so here we go. It's called The Flip. So a man named John Morgan wrote me after reading The Flip. A flip is a life-changing moment, often catalyzed by trauma or some other extreme event, in which a person enters an altered state of consciousness and subsequently reverses or flips her or his metaphysical perspective. Once holding to a strong materialist position in which consciousness is understood to be an evolutionary accident or a purely local epiphenomenon of brain processes, the flipped individual is now convinced that consciousness is a fundamental feature of the cosmos and not reducible to neurological or biological processes. Back to John Morgan. John is a professional copywriter in Los Angeles. His letter is an especially eloquent but fairly typical example of the kinds of letters I receive almost every week, and have been receiving for about a decade now, since I began writing and speaking in public about what I call the impossible. More on that in a moment. Here is John's flip in his own words. So this is taken directly from John's letter, and I've changed the details to preserve anonymity. I live in San Francisco. I was asleep one night in 2002 when I was awakened by the sound of a horrific car crash at the intersection. I heard the screech of brakes and then a violent crash. I bolted awake. My heart was pounding. My first thought was go outside, get the victim's help. I ran out of my house, but when I looked at the intersection, there was nothing. No smashed cars and no evidence of an accident, nor any cars at all. I was dumbfounded. It didn't feel like a dream. It was much more specific. What woke me up was a distinct experience of sound as opposed to something visual. My dreams are almost exclusively visual, so it didn't make sense that this was a dream. Still, I put myself back to bed and told myself it was probably a dream, however unique it felt. The next day, I went to work and followed my normal routine and went to bed around 11 p.m. Then in the middle of the night while I slept, I heard the exact same accident I heard the night before. The violent screech of brakes, the tremendous impact of metal versus metal. Again, I bolted up in bed. I distinctly remember being confused. Is this last night? Why is this repeating? What's going on? After a moment trying to process all this, I heard someone outside on the street shout something like, "Oh my God, somebody get help." At that point, I felt this wave of adrenaline rush through my body. All at once, I realized this was in fact a different night than the previous one, and this time the accident was real. I ran outside and a car had been T-boned, rolled several times and landed in my neighbor's yard. I learned that a young man in the car died. Later that night, I broached the subject with myself. Did I in fact have a precognition of the accident? A prosaic rationale would have been coincidence, but the odds of a searingly real dream of an accident coming the night before an actual accident seemed too great. I'd never dreamed of car accidents before. Besides, both of the crashes as I experienced them were exact. Same time of night, same location, same sounds. I didn't know what happened, but I knew it wasn't coincidence and was something supernatural or whatever it should be called. Okay, so that's the letter. We could now proceed for the rest of this talk with story after story like John's. Indeed, this is the water in which I professionally swim or drown. I am a historian of religions. I try to understand these experiences across cultural and temporal boundaries by placing them on a broad comparative table in order to make sense of them, not as disconnected, unrelated parts, but as a meaningful whole that suggests particular truths about the human or the superhuman. But I won't tell you these stories. I don't have the time. My goal is to provide you with some fairly simple ideas in the hope that something here might provide you with a few clues or provocations about where you might want to go with your own thoughts and stories. Okay, here's the first really simple idea. Stories like John's can be approached in at least two different ways. One historical and descriptive, and one philosophical and normative. To think in a more granular fashion, I like to imagine two bars that we can attempt to jump or pole vault over here, to employ an image from my failed days as a track and field athlete. I was a horrible pole vaulter. My brother was a pretty good high jumper, but I was terrible. This is the first bar. The first bar, so it's about this high. The first bar comes down to an admittedly simple question. Do such things really happen? Or are they really non-events? Functions, perhaps, of miscalculated coincidences, meaningless statistical outliers, or neurological blips of the pattern-seeking brain. Put more technically, do such events take place in both the mental and the material dimensions of human experience? Or are they simply mistakes of bad thinking, bad probability, projection, pathology, and so on? The same question, our first bar, can be put in terms of a much simpler one. Why do people believe impossible things? My own answer to this question goes something like this. People believe impossible things because impossible things happen to people. People around the world believe in a soul that is separable from the body because people around the world have experienced their own souls or those of others separating from their bodies in all sorts of situations. People around the world believe in some form of reincarnation because small children routinely remember in great detail their previous lives and report them to their parents and family, especially, it turns out, when their previous lives ended violently, suddenly, and unjustly. People around the world practice dream divination because people around the world occasionally dream of the future before it happens, and so on. The impossible is not impossible at all, it turns out. The impossible is simply a function of our own present physicalist belief systems, which declare all sorts of well-attested capacities and human potentials impossible because they are incompatible with that reigning system and its modes of knowing. This is where Dave stole my thunder. Put a bit differently, our conclusions are a function of our exclusions. And we have excluded a lot. If we put back on the table much of what we have taken off the table over the last few hundred years so that we could control the rules of the game and so manipulate and measure all the stuff that we allowed on the table, our conclusions will inevitably change, and so will we. The impossible will become possible. Please note that the historian or student of the religions does not need to believe any of the belief systems that build up around such extraordinary experiences to appreciate the utter reasonableness and power of such beliefs. To invoke another story documented in the literature, if any of us in this room had a disturbing dream the night before a school field trip that our young daughter would be left lying asleep on the train tracks in mortal danger, and exactly that played out the next day as we worried all day at home, most of us, I suspect all of us, would seriously entertain a belief in precognitive dreams, whatever our earlier education or training told us. We would not need to believe in God or prayer or guardian angels. We would only need to accept the facts of our own troubling experience. It's really that simple. Belief as intellectual assent to some past creedal statement is perfectly irrelevant in such contexts. It is a simple matter of empiricism, honesty, and in this case, a parent's well-founded fear. This first bar is not too difficult to get over. All one really needs is a certain level of charity and sympathy, or a child. Once one is over the first bar, the second bar quickly appears. The second bar comes down to the question of origin or cause. It goes like this. If these phenomena are a part of our mental material world, how exactly do they work? Are there mechanisms involved? Or is the search for mechanism misplaced and we should be looking for meaning and purpose instead? Such questions in turn lead naturally to another. Can such events tell us something important about ourselves, about the nature of consciousness as such? Take John's experience. If we accept that such a hearing things happened in both his dream world the first night and outside his window the second night, and I accept both, then such events may well point to something very profound about human consciousness, and in particular, about the location of consciousness in time. The event suggests, after all, that consciousness, particularly when altered by the emotional gravity of nightmare and impending tragedy, may not be entirely located in what we call the present. The now of consciousness might be much more extended than we imagine. We might not be the prisoners of history and time that we imagine. Okay? So the first bar and the second bar, okay. First bar, do they happen? Second bar, if they happen, how do they work? What's going on? Okay? Which leads me now to the third bar. The third bar asks, but if these impossible phenomena in fact take place in both the mental and material dimensions, which is the first bar, and suggest something about the nature of consciousness, which is our second bar, might they also sign or signal to us fundamental truths about the physical universe of which we are long evolved expressions? Might such events have something important to say about the behavior and structure of space, time, energy, and matter? Take John's precognitive nightmare again. It is hardly just a dream. It is also a Gedanken experiment, a thought experiment, just begging to be thought. And once thought, it clearly implies or leads to something like the philosophical position of eternalism, or a block cosmology in which the future already exists. This is actually a quite common cosmological model in physics today, where the whole universe is just there, and we're sort of moving through it, but past, present, and future are already just there. John's precise precognitive hearing of something in the near future does not prove such a cosmology, of course, but it clearly acts as a very suggestive sign of the same. It goads us, teases us to explore in that particular direction. It is a broken twig on the hunt, a sign along the way, but only if we recognize the twig as a sign, only if we know how to read the subtle twigs of the forest floor on our intellectual hunt. Easily one of the finest examples of a scholar attempting to get over all three bars is Paul Marshall in his recent The Shape of the Soul, What Mystical Experiences Tell Us About Ourselves and Reality. Note the subtitle. Marshall has serious training in the natural sciences at Cambridge, particularly physics, and is convinced that profound mystical experiences, including his own, have something crucial to tell us not only about the nature of consciousness, but also about the fundamental structure and behavior of the physical universe. Whether Paul's own highly reflective speculations are correct or not, and I'm not going to get into those, this is precisely the general direction I hope we might move now. The employment of both historical and personal mystical states as generators of future philosophy and scientific modeling. Please note that I'm not asking you to believe anything, nor am I claiming any certain knowledge. I am simply saying, I think we should move in that direction. Okay? I am reading the broken twigs on the forest floor to find the elk herd. I am suggesting that there are living thought experiments all around us, if only we would take them up and think them. In this same little spirit, allow me to share my own intellectual bets or wagers with you. First, a very general ontological wager, then four more specific ones. I'm going to take this coat off. It's really warm. There are two states in the Union I work and live in. One is Texas and one is California, and this shirt is a fusion of the two. I call it psychedelic Western. Okay, so I'm going to get a little technical here, but I think this will help kind of in our discussion. So my most general wager is that the total gestalt or whole gleaned or intuited from mystical literature strongly suggests that consciousness and the cosmos are two modes or expressions of the same fundamental reality, manifesting in us as knowing and experiencing subjects. The world is one, although it becomes two in our experiences when we split it up in our knowing and sensing. That is, when we become human subjects and are socialized into various reigning worldviews and identities. We don't do this consciously or intentionally, much less as individuals. We do this by virtue of being born into a specific body, language, family, and community, and becoming socialized subjects or persons who know physical objects, that is, who split the world up into two basic dimensions, the mental and the material, or the cultural and the natural. So this, I think, is our general experience as we sit here. We're honest with ourselves, unless you're some kind of enlightened being, which you might be. But if you're not, you're experiencing yourself as some kind of floating subjectivity looking out onto a physical world, and you're imagining that those are two different things. You're imagining that that's out there is physical and hard, and we're all seeing the same thing, and your subjectivity is somehow unique to you and is somehow separate from that external world. Reality always remains something other or more in its ground, but it also becomes all of the things, egos, and cultural worlds that we know and believe up here. Reality is one, but it really becomes two in us. We're the splitters. We split reality, but it's actually already one. In short, I lean strongly to some sort of monistic picture in a dual aspect mode. I have employed this model in my writing to understand the impossible as a meaningful collapse of the subject-object distinction, that is, as a temporary revelation of the dual aspect, monistic nature of reality. It is my opinion or my wager that such paradoxical events are anything but philosophical fluff or neurological blips. They are important signs on the forest floor pointing to a cosmos that is profoundly connected, that is one world in which impossible dreams like that of John Morgan become entirely possible. This partial or complete collapse of the subject-object structure, known partly and darkly in impossible events, and more fully and directly in mystical experiences, points to what I want to call the future of knowledge. If such a future of knowledge strikes you as too friendly to the gorilla of religion in our living room, allow me to remind you that modern science and technology have not somehow eliminated modern people's spiritual sensibilities. Quite the contrary, they have been wildly productive of new spiritual ideas and expressions. Think the near-death or psychedelic literatures, or the ever-increasing literature on the philosophy of quantum physics, which would have not happened without the advances of biomedical technology, modern chemistry, and of course quantum physics. So these are all examples of modern mystical literatures that just didn't exist before these technologies and sciences. So these sciences are producing new ways of being, maybe not religious, but certainly spiritual. Nor would have such modern literatures happened without the central role of the scientists themselves. The quantum philosophy literature, for example, was not born in the counterculture in the 1960s or by New Age enthusiasts in the 1980s, as is often commonly claimed. It was born at the beginning of quantum mechanics in founding figures like Schrödinger, Bohr, and Pauli, each of whom saw the profound parallels or correspondences that resonate between these different forms of human experience and expression, the mathematical and the mystical. So all of this literature on the quantum is somehow related to mystical. It all goes back to the founders themselves. It's pioneered by the scientists, not more recently. The religious imagination and its powers then have always been at work behind the secular scenes within a kind of esoteric history of science. A forbidden science. I didn't have this. Sorry about that. A forbidden science, as the computer and information scientist Jacques Vallée has named the venture in his published journals. It is time to acknowledge this fuller history of science, science not as imagined or proclaimed by a few elite dogmatic physicalists, but is actually practiced and lived on the ground and in the metaphysical closet. If you hang around with scientists, particularly scientists who are a little braver, they're fascinating creatures, and they often have exactly these kinds of experiences. And they'll talk about them over a beer or privately. They won't necessarily write about them or speak about them in public. So there's a kind of closeting effect that's going on that I think is a broader cultural problem. It is also time for the humanities to adopt much more radical models of writing history, models that are in tune with what we are currently suspecting about the nature of space-time, that it can be bent and curved, even turned back on itself, that it does not flow in just one direction. Can you imagine what a history that took precognitive phenomena as facts might look like? Can you imagine what we might look like? I pretend no objectivity here. Indeed, for philosophical reasons I have already hinted at, I would deny both the autonomy of a purely objective material realm and consequently the ideal of objectivity as such as an adequate stance. Objectivity is a half-truth. So is subjectivity. I speak just below or just above both out of a conviction that the future of knowledge will come when we are able to see through both as temporary effects of our own existence as subjects, perceiving an apparently objective world, and move out of this splitting into a more fundamental ground that preceded our own existence and will remain long after we as little egos are no more. The face we had before we were born, to invoke a Zen riddle. My present thought spins out of this double denial of the subject and object as it takes up the faceless face of the impossible, understood now not as some kind of superstitious detritus to leave behind, much less as the stuff of tabloids and rumor, but as a temporary collapse of the subject-object split that we in the physical universe seem to be. Need I add that such a collapse is no small thing? That is the sign still rejected of the very future of knowledge, which is also to say the future of us. So allow me to end now with a few suggestions. Signs on the forest floor again that I intuit in the mystical literature, but also in my correspondence with those hundreds of living individuals whom I affectionately call my mutants. That is, all those gifted, stunned, traumatized, zapped, or in one case, literally lightning-struck human beings who seek me out, wisely or not, for advice, moral support, and simple human understanding. I don't say that narcissistically. I think when you speak about these things in public or you write about them in public, people reach out. People who have had these experiences want just another human voice, essentially, to say, no, you're not crazy. No, I believe that these things happened. And that's what happens big time when you write about them in public, is people write you with their own stories. All right, there are 4 such signs of the future of us. You can hear these as attempted leaps over the 3 bars, as flips or as flops. But you will hear them, I dare say, not as they are, but as you are. Okay? Number 1, first, if I have anything to say, this was originally written for a bunch of physicists and philosophers of mind, so it's a little skewed in that direction, but I think it'll still work. If I have anything to say, it is this: please, please stop doing philosophy of mind exclusively around or in only one state of consciousness. Philosophers of mind like to talk endlessly about mintiness or redness. Okay? Please stop doing that. It's boring, and it doesn't get us very far. Okay? Philosophizing on the state of mind or in ordinary awareness can only get us so far, which is about where we are now. I personally see no good reason why this socialized, sense-based state of consciousness should have a monopoly on truth and our true place in the cosmos. Actually, I see all kinds of good reasons why it should not possess such a monopoly. Our senses, after all, evolved for us to survive and to kill things, to eat things, and to reproduce. That's why we sense the world the way we do. We don't sense the world as it is, we sense it so we can get along in it, essentially. If comparative mystical literature means anything, it means this: do not believe what you believe. Do not think what you think. Consciousness is not cognition. Consciousness is not culture. Consciousness is not ego. Such ordinary states of mind hide, camouflage, or distract from a deeper, more fantastic reality. There is another world, a reality that cannot be languaged or cognized in any ordinary way. The history of science suggests the same, of course. As Aldous Huxley observed many decades ago now, one can stare at water for years or even centuries and never guess that it is composed of 2 invisible gases bound to one another by entirely invisible forces. Okay? Who knew that water was hydrogen and oxygen? That's just like crazy. One must expose water to extreme and extraordinary conditions with the proper instruments to establish this fact. Something similar, Huxley pointed out, is true of human beings and the human spirit. One can stare at a human being or oneself for years or decades and never imagine that such a being is capable of entirely different states of consciousness, until, that is, such a human being is exposed to extreme or extraordinary conditions and splits apart into two. Okay? Huxley's metaphor is even more relevant today as we spend billions of dollars on the Hadron Collider under France and Switzerland to inflict the most exquisite, precise, and extreme violence on matter in order to fathom its otherwise completely unknown and unknowable components. This, I want to suggest to you, is more or less what comparative mystical literature gives us, those extreme or traumatic revelations of who and what we really are. Mystical literature is the Hadron Collider of human history. Accordingly, we should go there to understand the nature of consciousness as such. Okay, so that's my first wager. Wager number 2. But we should go there with discernment and the appropriate hermeneutical training, which brings me to my second plea, that we work toward a better understanding of the imagination. I continue to think that the imagination is the key to understanding and reading the signs of the impossible. Intellectuals commonly trip over such extreme experiences because they are often coded in Baroque or fantastic imagery and involve bizarre entities. Intellectuals reject such experiences because they literalize these visionary codes and cannot see through or beyond them. To complicate matters further, sometimes the imagination moves in the opposite direction and functions as a kind of supersense, even when it employs the stuff of dreams and visions. Its product should be read more literally here. Consider again John's experience with which I opened. The nightmare audition was employing the altered state of consciousness of dream. And yet, it was also a correct cognition of an all too empirical future event. How are we supposed to understand this mixing of the real and the imagined with our present banal models of the imagination as the imaginary? Obviously, we can't. And one of my strongest examples here is a few years ago, I brought a group of about 20 mostly anthropologists and philosophers and academics together up the road at Esalen for a conference on the imagination. And I asked them to do two things. I asked each person to come with her or his most bizarre story from her or his life. That was one. And then I asked them to give us a theory of the imagination that would make that bizarre event possible. Okay? And what happened was all of these really, really smart people had some crazy-ass story that made absolutely no sense, but actually happened to him or her. And no one had a theory of the imagination. So essentially they got over the first bar, but they didn't even attempt to get over the second bar because we simply lack any model of the imagination to make these things meaningful. We just don't have one. Third, I believe the textual and historical evidence for some kind of divinatory capacity of the human mind is overwhelming for anyone who chooses to spend the years necessary to examine the evidence. This same evidence, moreover, suggests some kind of block cosmology of space-time unity, that is, some kind of universe in which the future already exists and can flow backwards in time to signal itself to a human being, often again in highly symbolic or indirect ways. I have given a number of examples of this block time phenomenon in the flip, but the anthropologist Eric Wargo has given us access to hundreds of these in his recent work on what he so elegantly calls the tesseract of the human brain and its creative time loops. I highly recommend this book. fourthly, and most speculatively, and remember, I was speaking to a bunch of philosophers of mind who were just obsessed with the brain, just the brain this and the brain that, and microtubules and synapses and neurons and blah, 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 blah. It's all about the brain. So fourthly and most speculatively, I would like to suggest that if we are really serious about locating the precise locus in the human body where consciousness is initially received, translated by the imagination and eventually transformed into a person, we should not just be looking in the brain. We should also be looking at the heart region. I say this because this is what the mystical literature suggests, not very clearly and certainly not universally, but strongly enough to look into the possibility. I think it's very possible. We're just simply looking in the wrong place. So I really do understand how all four suggestions above are speculative, if not actually eccentric. I understand that these broken twigs on the forest floor may lead us not to our protein-rich elk herd, but into a barren valley or over a cliff. I could be very wrong about any one or all 4 points. I still think they are worth making. We need to think big and bold. We need to think otherwise now. We need to flip. Thank you very much.